Thank you very much. I'm delighted, see if I can bring this down. I'm delighted to be able to join you here, and I'd like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to exchange some perspectives and insights on this theme of the day, social entrepreneurship. In that spirit, first of all, I want to say that my theme that I'm going to be talking about is some of the myths that have arisen around social entrepreneurship that I would like to explore and also tell you why they are myths. Bill Drayton touched on a few of them, but I will do that more specifically. And I want to also confess from the very outset of this presentation that I am beginning to intensely dislike the term social entrepreneur. Why? I like the term much more that I think the president of KDI introduced this morning, which is collective capitalism. And the reason why I find that social entrepreneurship as a term to describe what we see today is perhaps already outdated is that it immediately makes people think that social entrepreneurs are charities and that they depend on volunteers, and it immediately puts them into that category, when in fact that's not the case, as I will show you. So this afternoon, in the time that I have, I want to share some reflections that have evolved over more than 20 years of working with some of the world's leading entrepreneurs for society. And I'm going to begin by clarifying the nature of social entrepreneurial endeavor in general, and go on to highlight, again, as I said, what I think some of the myths around social entrepreneurship are. And I will also touch on what I believe to be the role of government in relation to social entrepreneurial initiatives, because I can see that that's on some people's minds. And throughout, I will refer to examples of social entrepreneurs and their organizations. So let me begin with the following statement. Entrepreneurs, whether they are commercial or social in orientation, are really cut from the same cloth. They are very similar in their characteristics. So it seems appropriate to highlight the essence of what entrepreneurship activity is in general, and then distinguish those who are primarily driven by the value appropriation from those primarily driven by social value creation, keeping in mind that all entrepreneurs have to do a bit of both to survive. So in any situation, whether it's business as usual or the status quo, it implies the existence of an equilibrium, which, even if it's not very satisfactory or it's inefficient, is the only thing that exists at that time. People simply put up with the shortcomings. Now, the entrepreneur focuses on addressing that dissatisfactory equilibrium by providing an innovative solution. And let me show you how. It could be a new product or a new service or a new process. For example, I know you all know Sergey Brin and Larry Page, who are the founders of Google, right? They identified what we would call an unsatisfactory equilibrium in the slowness of the search engines on internet that existed. It wasn't that they came up with the first search engine. There were many search engines around at the time, but they were very slow. So as entrepreneurs, they exploited that opportunity by improving the search engine speed, among other things, and in so doing, they launched Google, which today we know has raised the bar for all search engines and created a massively successful commercial enterprise that's gone on not only to appropriate value for shareholders, the financial value, but we also might argue create very important social value given the numbers of times a day that we use Google for free for all types of different reasons. Likewise, I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Wikipedia, Jimmy Wales. Jimmy identified an unsatisfactory equilibrium in access to credible information on current and historical people, places, events, ideas, etc. And so he spearheaded this wildly popular Wikipedia as a free, open content encyclopedia, which today is available in the world's leading 10 languages. I don't know if you have it here in Korea, but Wikipedia is pretty much accessible everywhere. But Jimmy is not a commercial entrepreneur. His intent is not to appropriate financial value for shareholders. His priority was to create a massive social value for people all over the world. So Jimmy doesn't have shareholders, and in fact, his Wikipedia is set up as a not-for-profit organization. But the point is that the Sergey Brins, the Larry Pages, the Jimmy Waleses of the world are all entrepreneurs. They are driven by this perceived opportunity which they relentlessly pursue. They're not, even the commercial entrepreneurs, they are not propelled simply by money. The difference between Google and Wikipedia is that from Google's very beginning, the perceived opportunity of creating a new or improved product or service was with the expectation that it would attract advertising dollars, generating financial profits for the creators and the investors. And as such, profit was essential to achieve this massive uptake and market mainstreaming. Now, entrepreneurs, on the other hand, such as those that Bill pointed out this morning, Rodrigo Baggio, Mary Gordon, etc., they are not driven by profit. They are driven by social value creation. However, they are actually responding to market and government failures. They work where businesses have failed to come up with innovative ways to design and deliver the goods and services needed to address social, economic, and environmental challenges because the risks are too great and the profits aren't enough. Similarly, those issues that governments have been unable to tackle because of financial, political, or bureaucratic constraints, those sorts of entrepreneurs, what we are today really calling social entrepreneurs, are drawn to deal with such challenges, and they transform the systems and practices that have stood in the way of these pragmatic, equitable, and sustainable solutions. So with this in mind, let me proceed to deconstruct some of the myths that have surrounded social entrepreneurship, keeping in mind that these entrepreneurs and their commercial counterparts are creating innovative, resourceful, and highly scalable solutions using market-based approaches to address the challenges that loom large before us. But for the social entrepreneur, the primary purpose is to change the world for the better, independent of whether they succeed in creating the next little widget or the next web-based platform that generates millions of dollars. Now, the first myth surrounding social entrepreneurs, indeed any entrepreneur, is what I call the Lone Ranger myth. We have this idea that these people single-handedly achieve their results, and nothing could be further from the truth. It actually is about the kind of leadership that they provide. Now, Kuznets and Posner, who are gurus on the subject of leadership, defined leadership as, quote, the art of mobilizing others to want to struggle for shared aspirations. All leadership involves inspiration, vision, competence, and interpersonal skills, very much aligned with what Bill said this morning. And that is exactly what social entrepreneurs do. Because imagine, we are human beings and none of us likes to change. It's very difficult for us to change. So it takes a huge amount of courage, of persuasion, of passion to actually infect other people that the idea that you have is actually a feasible idea that can change the world. And that can only be done by a different kind of leadership that combines intellectual humility and personal confidence, and which doesn't confuse ambition with omniscience. As a leader in this space, enhancing that architecture of participation means that you have to impose limits on your ego. Overcoming sort of this, oh, I know everything because I am the CEO kind of leadership that seems to be the default in most companies. This means questioning your own personal and very long-held assumptions about the way the world works, about your expertise and your experience, which is really, when you think about it, the very cornerstone of where our professional and traditional careers are built upon. But this ability to unlearn ushers in an openness to creative, innovative, and market-generating ideas that no one else had detected. So the nature of leadership in the organizations that social entrepreneurs set up is best captured by two of my favorite business school teachers, very different business school teachers than any you've ever had at the University of Stockholm, Jonas Rittelstralle and Kiel Nordstrom. And they said the following, and I quote, "The traditional hierarchical firm won't be a problem in the 21st century. It won't be around. The new organization will be hierarchical, containing many different clusters of different kinds. So forget organizational pyramids with the CEO sitting at the top of them. Who wants to work in pyramids, the greatest tombs ever created by man? Playgrounds must gradually replace pyramids." I love that quote. Now, the second myth refers to scale. Over the last decade, one of the most frequently repeated concerns among entrepreneurs, philanthropists, investors, the public sector leaders, etc., is how come these organizations don't scale? They don't get big. They remain small. You know, how come they haven't had this massive impact? And the concern really has become this clarion call in the face of these huge looming problems, the big threats that we all face to people and the planet, from climate change and, energy shortage, pandemics, etc. President Bill Clinton even expressed the challenge of scale when he was looking at the fate of school reform initiatives under his presidency, and he said, "Nearly every problem has been solved by someone somewhere. The frustration is that we can't seem to replicate those solutions anywhere else." Indeed, if one reviews the key selection criteria for some of the most important organizations that select social entrepreneurs, similar to Ashoka, Schwab Foundation, Skoll Foundation, etc., the issue of scale and the issue of how big an impact can this have is very much at the forefront of their criteria. And no one would doubt that the size and the breadth and the scope of an organization is directly related to its impact, both positive and negative. If you want to get some perspective on what big can mean, we only need to look at what the world's very biggest company is, according to the Financial Times, and that is ExxonMobil. This gas and oil giant is in over 200 countries and has an annual budget of $500 billion. And as much as we may question this multinational's business ethics and environmental sustainability, now probably we question BP as well, the company has had a huge impact on our lives. There's no question about that. Now, this Fortune 500 company mentality has influenced the way we think about what scale needs to be for social entrepreneurs, which is crazy, and those of us working to support them. It has obviously come to mean growing one organization from a locally spawned into a huge multinational, preferably across many continents. But as we're increasingly coming to realize, these companies have only been able to scale to a size like ExxonMobil because of the infrastructure, the ecosystem, the legal and fiscal support that governments have put into place to support that huge growth, not to mention the involvement of financial markets in supporting that, and shareholders and consumers, etc. So these entrepreneurial giants and their companies became household names practically overnight. Think about it. Bill Gates, Richard Branson, Warren Buffett, George Soros, Ted Turner, and then there's a whole younger group of them, including Jeff Skoll, Pierre Omidyar, Sergey Brin, etc. But that wealth generally benefited primarily educated and affluent populations. And their wealth was not able to, this new economy wealth wasn't able to bring in the hundreds and millions of people who were marginalized. So when these entrepreneurs went off, like Jeff, the person who gave money for our foundation, or Klaus Schwab, who gave money for the foundation that I set up called the Schwab Foundation, basically They thought scale equated these big, huge organizations. And it's natural that they thought that because that's the mental model that they had. So the last few years, we've seen a real shift in this discussion. So while the importance of scale is still very much at the forefront of our thinking, we realize that perhaps the corporate model for social entrepreneurship is not the right model for social ventures in that sense. And that, in fact, you can grow an organization to huge size and never have an impact on the issue that you're trying to address. And what social entrepreneurs are trying to do is, as Bill said, change the world. So the model of growing one huge organization because they need to have market share in order to dominate the market is not the way social entrepreneurs operate. And I'm going to give you a very specific example of that in a minute. We need to think about a different model of scale. The central unit of analysis in commercial entrepreneurship has been the organization. But in social entrepreneurship, the central unit of analysis is the issue: unsustainable livelihoods, pollution, etc. So social entrepreneurs work with others around that issue. It's not that they personally need to accumulate huge amount of staff and huge amount of wealth to be able to dominate market, but it's through the contagion factor, through what Bill called that ethical fiber of persuading others to join forces, that they're really able to leverage their opportunity in that sense. So if you really think about it, you just look back at history. Let's look at the environmental movement, the women's movement, even, unfortunately, the terrorist movement, the election of Barack Obama. These things were not achieved because one organization grew to huge scale. It's because they generated social movement, a social movement. And that's what we need to think about when we think about what we need to create when we're looking at social entrepreneurship. It's not about one organization dominating everything. It is about how do we all join forces to create a movement that's going to completely change the pattern of where our societies are going. And in this sense, I have to say, and take my hat off to, I'm not an academic, even though I have a PhD, even though I teach at business school and run a research center. I'm basically an entrepreneur. And why am I in academia today? I'll tell you. Because I've had the privilege in the last 3 years of being exposed to young people. And contrary to what many people say, it is amazing how many young people want a different world, and how many young people are really engaged in solving issues and solving problems. And particularly in the business school where I am, there's this model that the way we separate our lives is first I make my money and then I make a foundation and I give back to philanthropy. That's not the way these students want. They say, why should I wait till I'm 55 and almost dead? Well, at 55 I can tell them they're not going to be almost dead, but why should I wait until I'm old to do things that are fun and interesting? I want to apply my talents now to change the world. How do I combine my business talent and my MBA to actually come up with new and better ways of doing things? And that is why I'm at Oxford, and that is why I teach at Columbia Business School, because these students are the business leaders of tomorrow. And just like Bill and just like Mary, who work on empathy, if I know it's too late to start working on empathy when you're in graduate school, but if you don't have those models for what your next career move is going to be, you're going to end up a very frustrated 50-year-old creating your foundation and giving back. A fourth myth, I think, is around the notion of what government role should be. And here I'm going to take a leaf from the page of what's happening in the UK. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not British, but I actually know the model in Britain quite well, and sometimes I worry that it may well be infecting other ways in other countries. And the US model isn't so great either, so you need to come up with your own model in Korea, okay? Number one. Number two, government thinks that it has to do everything, and people think that government has to do everything. And if you ask most entrepreneurs when they started, where they got their money, it's what they say, the 3 F's: family, fools, and friends. They don't go to government, because government is about preserving the status quo. It's not about change. That's number one. Number two is the following. Government still hasn't understood that social entrepreneurs are innovators. They are still seeing them as service providers, that they can subcontract for a service, much like a charity. So what we need to understand is that, like business entrepreneurs that are coming up with the solutions in their garages, social entrepreneurs are the mad scientists working in the social innovation lab to come up with the new models that is going to address society's ills. They are not solutions for government to subcontract to go and provide services. So they might be providing services, but it's within a framework of change, and that's the key. Government also needs to learn to stay out of the way, to be able to fund, but not to mandate this or that or the other. And government tends to want to get its hands in many pots. So that's what's happened in Britain, is that social enterprise has come to mean a business that has a revenue that basically provides services for a very poor, impoverished area, and the government pays them to do that. That is not innovation. That's Band-Aid approach. So be careful when you're thinking about what the model is for Korea. And in the United States, it's completely charity. In other words, you've got, on the one hand, you've got your NGO, your 501c3, your charity, and on the other hand, you've got business. And here's where I make my money, and here's where I do good. And I might be completely canceling myself out. I remember when I was working, and some big, huge foundation came, I was working on tobacco prevention, and a big foundation came to me and said, we want to give you money for your program. And then I said, that's fantastic, I'd love to have, we really need it. And then I found out that where had they invested the capital of their endowment? In British American tobacco. And they wanted me to do the work. In other words, they were canceling out their work completely by investing money in a tobacco company and then coming to me with their charity arm and saying, here's money to address tobacco. That doesn't make sense, and it happens all the time. So I think it's really an important distinction there. Another myth, perhaps it's more a misunderstanding than a myth, is that all social entrepreneurship should be nonprofit. That's ridiculous. We actually, and I think that probably Vishnu is going to touch on this, have different, more and more. If you want to be an entrepreneur that's going to change society, you need to think about, how am I going to be sustainable? And in most parts of the world, that means that there is no philanthropy. Philanthropy is not developed. Government's not always going to be present. So you have to think about, what is the best model to achieve my goal? Not, should I set up a charity because then people will give me money? Because people aren't going to give you money. It's very difficult to get money, and any entrepreneur will tell you that. So more and more what we're finding is that entrepreneurs who want to change the world come up with some of the most creative business models around, and many of them are for profit. And I think that that's a really important, they're for profit, but they're not profit maximizing. They put their profits back into growing their organization, and that's really important. And then I just want to give you a very specific example of somebody, because he really captures this idea that it's not about just not-for-profit, and also the way entrepreneurs work and the logic. This is a fantastic entrepreneur that I met a couple of years ago when he was just starting out. His name is Jeff Mendelson, and he was researching what are the most contaminating industries in the world. And do you know what it turns out to be? The paper industry. The paper industry is one of the most polluting industries in the world. So he decided, as any crazy, unreasonable entrepreneur, to take on the paper industry. Imagine that. It's a little bit like Don Quixote, the famous knight in Cervantes' Spanish story. What Jeff has done also gives you an idea of what it means to have scale and impact. He set up a paper company, for profit, called New Leaf Paper. And what he did was he completely started to reverse the way paper was produced, so that he wasn't using any of the new virgin forest, et cetera, et cetera. And what ended up happening was big companies, because they were interested in reducing their global footprint, started buying paper from Jeff's a New Leaf paper company. And he started growing and started growing. So all of these big paper producers started looking at the fact that now New Leaf paper was actually competing in the same space and that people were coming to him to buy that product. And by the way, his company is about 40 people today. It's about $60 million company. But it's a teeny little thing in comparison to the giants that are out there in the paper industry. But Jeff is about influencing the paper industry and the people who. So his ambition is not to grow New Leaf huge, but what's happened is his competitors are now adopting New Leaf practice for producing paper. And that's what he wants to do. He wants to influence the industry to change their practice. So that's very different. He knows he's a David in a Goliath scenario. He will never be the huge paper industry. And he knows he will eventually be put out of business, which if you think about it, for a profit-making company, is the kiss of death to be put out of business. For Jeff, it means a triumph, because it means that he no longer is needed to push, and people in that industry, mainstream industry, are taking up that model. So that's a very important lesson in terms of that kind of thing. And then lastly, I just want to touch on the role of investors and philanthropists, because I think here is where we've got a real problem. And I could see when the question was asked about the social capital market, it's very hard not to be passionate about this area because there's so much what's wrong with the way things operate now. If you're going to scale to the issue, and you're not about growing your organization huge, obviously you need to strengthen your organization, you need capital to do that. But in the world of philanthropy, in the world of donors, what do they want? They want to prove to their board that their investment is, in fact, great. And so they need to differentiate what this organization does and why they do it better from what this other organization does, even if they're doing the same thing. So the donor actually acts to fragment social entrepreneurship. Instead of saying, we're going to actually give money to fund 10 entrepreneurs that are addressing deforestation, which is what needs to happen. What they're saying is, oh no, we're just going to give to this one. And then this one has to make beautiful PowerPoint presentations and beautiful stories to prove that they're better than the other one that actually is doing pretty much the same thing and that they should be allying with. So again, this mentality of fragmentation is very difficult to overcome. And I think that that's important. And on the other hand, for for-profit social enterprise, the whole issue of investment, again, usually investors come in and they say, I want you to cure AIDS in 3 years, and I want my money back. Or, very short-term. Investors in social enterprise, remember, social entrepreneurs are trying to change things that are very difficult, and they're tackling some of the world's biggest problems. So investors need to be in it for the long haul. They need to be, it's patient capital that these organizations are requiring. It's not, the instant New York minute change that we're all looking for. So just to conclude, I think we're in a really exciting time. Again, number one, generations are changing. Certainly I see it before my eyes. Number two, there's great things to be said about the really huge economic problems. I mean, the whole issue that where our economies have been failing and crumbling is a wonderful opportunity to create a new way of doing things. Like a phoenix that rises from the ashes and creates something, we have an opportunity to create a completely new economy. And you can say, yeah, but what am I? I'm just one person. You don't need to do it alone. That's what I'm talking about, forming a movement. And this movement is across generations, but unless we all join and work together to create that movement, to create those organizations that are fundamentally innovative, philosophically positive, and morally compelling, we're not going to get out of this rut. And so I'm really hopeful that here in Korea, you will all be infected by this need to create a movement around social entrepreneurship. Thank you very much.